Soul Repair Center's December 2023 webinar, Racism in the Military and Chaplaincy as Morally Injurious. I'm Nancy Ramsay. I'm privileged to serve as the director of the Soul Repair Center at Brite Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. The center provides resources for religious leaders and professional caregivers who support veterans and their families and active duty personnel affected by moral injury. We offer free webinars September through May, focusing on topics related to moral injury relevant for veterans and active duty personnel and those who care for them, including religious leaders. The center works in cooperation with the Shea Center on Moral Injury of the VOA, which co-sponsors these webinars. The Shea Center is directed by Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock, who founded the Soul Repair Center. The recording of this webinar will be available in 7 to 10 days and will be added to our index collection of all previous webinars. We hope that it is useful to you, that collection, and supports research in moral injury. In this webinar, we name and explore the consequences of racism in the military and the chaplaincy as morally injurious and detrimental for readiness. Racism is an interlocking system of advantage based on race, a form of systemic inequality that privileges whiteness. For those who suffer its inequalities, racism is dehumanizing and emotionally harmful. It is also consequential because its distortions are reflected in reviews and promotions. While a distinct form of oppression, racism often amplifies other coexisting forms of marginalization, such as sexism. Racism weakens the military by creating institutional barriers to equal opportunities for all to advance and flourish. We'll hear from U.S. Navy Captain Dale White, who addresses the fact and harm of racism in the military and chaplaincy. Then we'll turn to two respected officers who draw on their own experience of racism in the military to describe its harm. Such harm is deepened because racism in the military and chaplaincies remains unacknowledged and unaddressed. Racism is a long-standing challenge in American culture. For the military to create a space of equality for all, leadership and training must clearly demonstrate no tolerance for it. Currently, curricula for those entering the armed services, the military chaplaincy, and officer training are silent about racism. Instead, they need to name it as a structural system of advantage and provide instruction for resisting it. Racism undermines readiness in each of the branches of the armed forces. Effective leadership is needed to name and confront racism and its dehumanizing harm for those whom it harms directly, and for those who enact or fail to prevent that harm. Colonel Mark Lee, chaplain of the U.S. Army, serves as Dean of the Army Graduate School. Previously, he directed the CP Center at Brooke Army Medical Center, San Antonio. He holds a DMin and PhD and certifications in ACPE and BCC. Chaplain Lee previously served as chief of the Theater of Spiritual Resilience as the Army Europe Africa headquarters in Wiesbaden. He also served in South Korea and deployed twice in Iraq. Prior to his service in the Army, Chaplain Lee served as a senior pastor of Community Church of Honolulu and currently as a chaplain in the Hawaii Air National Guard. He holds a PhD from the University of Aberdeen, Scotland, a DMin from Erskine Seminary, an MDiv from Princeton Theological School, and an MBA and BDS from the University of Southern California. Timi Lindsay, Captain U.S. Navy retired. Captain Lindsay retired from the Navy in 2021 after 30 years of honorable service. In her past 4 years of military service, Captain Lindsay served as Chief Diversity Officer at the U.S. Naval Academy. She was a trusted team member at the highest levels in the Department of Defense to build, lead, and manage a joint team to advise on policy and procedural issues associated with culture of excellence, diversity and inclusion, equal employment opportunity, and military equal opportunity sexual harassment. She implemented and led 2 task force teams to identify inequities by gender and race ethnicity, resulting in the formulation of the Navy's D&I Roadmap and the Naval Academy's Diversity and Inclusion Strategic Plan, designed to improve the Navy's diversity and retention initiatives. Timi now draws on her leadership and DEI expertise through Anchored Leadership Solutions, a company she established. For example, she planned and executed 2 leadership development conferences for the Naval Academy Alumni Association. She is now completing an organizational assessment and training plan for a veteran nonprofit in California, Swords to Plowshares. Timi has frequently partnered with organizations in better understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion in their organizations. Her daughter is a graduate of the Naval Academy, and her son will graduate soon. Timi recently traveled to New England to finish her 1-year Freedom to Serve tour, which celebrates the 75th anniversary of President Truman's executive orders that desegregated our military and federal government. Captain Dale White, U.S. Navy retired, was commissioned as a naval officer chaplain in 1992. Prior to his commission as a naval chaplain, the Reverend Dr. White earned his MDiv from Drew University and DMin from Wesley Theological Seminary, Washington, D.C. Reverend White was ordained in the United Methodist Church in 1984. He served congregations in New York and concurrently as a chaplain in the burn unit and pediatric ICU in Nassau County Medical Center. As a Navy chaplain, Captain White served in multiple settings, including the Marine Corps base in Okinawa, the Chief of Naval Operations, the Pentagon 2001 through 2004, and 2010 through 2013, Camp Lejeune and Fallujah, Iraq, 2007 through 2010, Naval Personnel Command, Tennessee, 2013 through 2018, and Marine Corps Training and Education, Quantico, Virginia, 2018 through 2021. He was in the Pentagon on 9/11 and provided pastoral care to Navy families whose loved ones were killed in the attack on the Pentagon. In Fallujah, 70 of the personnel he served there were killed, and over 1,000 were wounded. Chaplain White earned the Combat Action Ribbon and Bronze Star. In retirement, he serves as Director of Congregational Excellence, Valley Ridge District, Virginia Annual Conference. His work includes helping congregations to connect with partner organizations and to develop strategic plans and vision. I also wish to express my appreciation to U.S. Navy Captain Johnny Poole, retired, who was an invaluable colleague in developing this webinar. Captain Poole founded and now directs a valuable resource that brings the skills of retired military chaplains to various public organizations and businesses. Chaplain Care is a dedicated partner in combating moral injury. It is a veterans-led provider of professionally trained interfaith workforce chaplains who are equipped to shape and strengthen programs in business and nonprofit organizations that support individuals in faith, leadership, and lifelong learning. You may learn more about it at chaplaincare.com. We also appreciate the expertise of U.S. Navy Chaplain Lieutenant Natisha Walker, one of the Navy's leaders in attending to diversity, equity, and inclusion. She provided counsel as we developed this webinar. A recording of this webinar will be available on the Soul Repair Center site and the VOA YouTube channel in 1 week. Now let's turn our attention to Captain Dale White.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ramsay, for this opportunity. And thank you, Dr. Poole, for providing us with the resources. It's my honor to support on a volunteer basis chaplain care, as you can see over my shoulder. It's also my honor to join in this webinar with these distinguished panelists, Captain Timi Lindsay and Colonel Mark Lay. This is a unique time in the year, and it's unique because it's holy days for many people. From Hanukkah to Christmas to Bodhi Day for Buddhists, it's a special time culturally with Kwanzaa, with Human Rights Day. It's a time for us to pause and to reflect and to look internally and to challenge ourselves to internal growth as part of our journey as lifelong learners. And this webinar is such a time. Dr. Ramsay has stated the problem, the theme as racism in the military and chaplaincy as moral injurious. How can I add to this discussion? As you can see just by looking at me on the screen. Well, I grew up in a community rich in diversity. I was ordained in 1984 by the first African-American bishop in the United Methodist Church. I was assigned to my church's pre-Navy by African American district superintendents and was married to my wife now of 40 years by an African American pastor. All unplanned, because the world that I grew up in was broad and was diverse. That was my norm. And when I joined the military from that background on Long Island, I expected the military would be ahead of the church. As a white male in the military with a marginalized and minoritized son and daughter, son of Black and Asian heritage, my expectations of diversity, equity, inclusion were based both on my background, but also on historical initiatives in the military that I perceived it to be ahead of its time. Tuskegee Airmen, Montford Marines, Civil Rights Act of 1964, men and women of diverse backgrounds serving and fighting side by side together. That was my expectation. Many good things I discovered, but here are some of the things that I did find. Those historical references that I share can be likened to getting the football, and I will not refer to the Army-Navy game here, but which I just did, but are likened to getting the ball well short of the end zone, well short. My colleagues who will speak in just a moment are better equipped to determine whether the ball is on the 15-yard line or it's still on the 50-yard line. But here are 4 observations that I have in my almost 30 years in the Navy of why we are well short of the end zone. It wasn't until I was on active duty in my 28th year that my commander, a 3-star, had the first honest discussion and stand down on the issue of racism. 28 years in the military. And at that stand down, I heard colleagues, colonels and lieutenant colonels, sergeants majors and master guns, people who did not allow any sort of victimization to stop their forward movement, but who had to push harder, and they shouldn't have had to push harder, to reach those levels. And it was the first time I heard true, honest discussions about marginalization and minoritization. Secondly, in 2020 hindsight, I think that significant discussion is and training in the military, for me in the Navy, was spent on hot issues, on sexual assault, on suicide prevention, and in the Chaplain Corps, my community, on religious diversity, cooperation with compromise. Those are all important things, but we never had a CPE, clinical pastoral education, hard discussion on racism. The assumption seemed to be it was a past problem, not a current problem. Third point, in my retirement, I had pre-retirement had the privilege of having a position that very few chaplains other than Chaplain Poole and I have had, and that was the assignments officer or detailer for a community. Being a detailer, a senior detailer, allows you information and knowledge, both personal and communal, that others do not have, sometimes not even the chiefs of our communities. We hear about people's struggles and challenges, and that position has allowed me to develop relationships so that now in my post-military career, I still get called on frequently. And what I've noticed is that in the calls I get, sometimes 3 or 4 a week, 80 to 90% are calls from chaplains who fall in the minoritized, marginalized populations. Why is that? I have a theory, and my theory is lack of trust in the institution and possibly fear, and these are results of moral injury, fear of retribution. And that's what moral injury is. The effects of moral injury can include guilt and shame and anger, people that are afraid and are hesitant. And so they need to turn somewhere. And my fourth point, a recent CNN article discussed the study in 2015 by the U.S. Coast Guard on the culture of respect, where results were released but suppressed for the last 8 years, talking about the issues of bullying, racism, harassment, intimidation, and retaliation. And there is indeed an environment, so to speak, of silence and of suppression. Let me just share a couple of way aheads before I turn it over to my colleagues to move forward in the next section of this webinar. Staying in my lane as a chaplain. Chaplains individually are tasked with 4 core capabilities by their community, at least in the Navy. And those are provision and facilitation, making sure people have their freedom of worship and freedom of religious needs met. The third is care. They care for all. But there's one core capability that I think we have that we need to do a better job with, and that is advisement. Advisement is a capability wherein chaplains are given a direct access to their commanding officers to advise them on issues that are of concern. And this issue is one that chaplains need to be better trained on, as well as the core capability. They need to be given training so that they have the boldness and the professional tools to approach their commanders so that they're not in the Navy like I was for 28 years before the commanding officer has a true and honest discussion. And finally, the chaplain corps community needs to train in their pipelines on DEI. We received a lot of training on religious cooperation. We received a lot of training on sexual assault and suicide prevention. I don't ever recall training on racism. As a policy writer in the Chief of Chaplain's office for over 6 years, we wrote a lot of policies on professional naval chaplaincy. We wrote a lot of policies and implementing policies, but I never recall us writing a policy on this topic. There are new DEI instructions, both at the DOTI instructions in 2020 and the OPNAV, at least in the Navy, instruction 5420, which was released last year. Chaplain corps policies need to do a better job at integrating racism and moral injury as part of their training and training pipeline and policy. And they also need to tie in and integrate with the DOD level and service level on these DEI policies. As I've read the new current policies, almost nowhere is there any reference to chaplains other than what the chaplains should be doing in their communities, but there's no reference to the rich possibility of what chaplains offer to service members, or what chaplains can offer to service members who are morally injured because of racism, marginalization, and minoritization. Thank you. And now I think we turn it over to Captain or Colonel Lee, correct?
Thank you. And when this topic was brought up, I volunteered to be part of the panel. And then after thinking about it for a while, I had to think to myself, you know, how has my experience been different and or similar? I think one of the places that I like to start with is back in 2005 when I came on active duty with the Army and came to this very place where I am now, Fort Jackson, back when it was called the U.S. Army Chaplain Center and School. I came to the basic course as an intro to Army chaplaincy. And there I experienced one of my classmates in his most innocent way approaching me and wanting to befriend me and talk about his experience as a missionary in Korea and just wanted to really get close to me. And I'm thinking, well, I did not grow up in Korea. I was born in Korea. I was raised in Hawaii. I have really not a whole lot of places of relating with him. And in one of the conversations, he said, I love you Koreans. And I was like, oh, us Koreans, okay. Um, and one of the reasons why I like Koreans so much is you stick to your kind. I said, what? Jack, back off. My kind? What are you talking about? It's like Koreans, Koreans stick to Koreans. And I said, well, look to my left, who's a seminary friend of mine. He's married to a Korean woman and he's Caucasian. I have one of my sisters married to a Japanese American. I have another sister married to a Polish American. I know a lot of Koreans that don't stick to our kind. Thank you very much. And I said, you sound like a racist if I ever experienced one. And mind you, I grew up in Hawaii, so I didn't have a whole lot of experience with in-your-face kind of ignorance and racist attitudes. And so I went to the course manager and I said, I think we have a problem here. And I explained to the course manager my experience. And he said to me, Chaplain Lee, you better learn to grow some thick skin. Because if you think there isn't racism in the Army, you got another thing coming. And if you don't know that we have racists in the Chaplain Corps, you certainly have another thing coming. And that to me was a moment of awakening, a moment of shock and awe, really feeling marginalized and recognizing I really am a minority in this Army. As much as we talk about equality, as much as we talk about diversity and inclusion, there is an undercurrent of subtle, and I don't want to blanketly say that it's racist, but a lot of it is ignorance and racist attitudes that some people don't even recognize that they have. And over the years, I had to also ask myself, because I have been called a banana. And for those of you who don't know what a banana is, it's someone who's yellow on the outside, white on the inside. And I have recognized that there is a part of me that has become so, as you would call it, maybe whitewashed. And the question is, how much assimilation have I done to fit in to the majority white population, especially in the Army? Part of it was probably my own way of surviving. Part of it is probably my way of sort of differentiating myself with others. And all over the years, questions of institutional racism and or ignorance as opposed to individualized racism, it's been subtle. I think for me, my experience is that a lot of it was very subtle. Comments like, your English is very good. And I'm like, well, I hope so. I grew up in the States, so I think that would be a given. But and or comments such as where there are some other Korean chaplains whose English is not their primary language, and they certainly have an accent in their speech. So I've gotten senior chaplains who come to me and say, "Can you go talk to so and so and have them go take some English classes and coach them on their English?" Back then I didn't realize it, but that's what we would say in CPE, triangulation. And why does it fall on me to be the one to go and talk to another person, particularly because a senior level chaplain believes that the other person's English isn't fluent enough, and or comments about the competence of someone because their English isn't a native speaking level of English. Over the years, those are the kinds of comments and attitudes that I've witnessed and experienced. And again, part of it, I feel like I've participated in some of that. So I hold a personal guilt of some sort with regard to my own participation in some of those attitudes. And I think as an Asian American, it's rather easy for me to fit in with the majority because uh, we're sort of the adopted model minority. That myth is out there. Just my culture tells me keep your head down, do your work, and assimilate, and you'll succeed. And so maybe I bought into that earlier in my career as well. And certainly my experiences of either explicit or implicit racism is not anywhere near pronounced as for African Americans or even Hispanics. But those are I can go on and on about a few more examples, but I don't have all day. Um, and so over the years, what I've realized is what's my responsibility and my ability to speak out against particular acts of discrimination or even racist attitudes. As a younger captain or even as a major, it was a little difficult. But as I got into becoming an educator with CPE, as I rose in rank, um, and as I rose also in responsibility, I recognized that the responsibility really comes down to me now, as one of the senior leaders, to point it out and speak up when it does happen, when I see it, even when I think it's very subtle. So, a case in point, we had an incident with one of my residents when I was at Brooke Army Medical Center last year, where it's a female Korean American, and one of the staff chaplains from the hospital had some comments to make about her performance on the floor, particularly dealing with the group that she was working with. And as initially I felt there's something going on here, and that's perhaps the both sexism and racism. And then when I sat down with that chaplain and spoke with him, uh, kind of keeping straight what is your lane, what is my lane, what's really the issue at hand, I also sensed from him a bit of racist attitude towards me. And so I directly went to his supervisor and alerted the supervisor as to my experience and my assessment of this individual. And so then they got proper um, counseling and was spoken to. And those are the times when I'm realizing, especially now, that my responsibility as a senior leader is to speak up and be the advocate and the voice for the voiceless and the power to the powerless. Because I hear it from captains through majors out in the field all the time now about their experiences of both racism and sexism. And really, what that comes down to is demoralizing. Um, and it really kills the morale of the individuals. And then it also demotivates them from wanting to do their job and interact. And we've had people who have left the Army because of these terrible experiences of discrimination, overtly as well as very uh, covertly. And I think really what the Army Chaplain Corps, and that particularly what I try to do in our clinical pastoral education programs throughout the Army, in our 3 centers, we really incorporate multi faith, interfaith as well as cultural diversity in our curriculum, so that we are really ingraining in our chaplains that come through our residency programs the notion of what it means for their privilege if they are white, and what it means to be the advocates for those who have no voice and who have no power to speak up for themselves in situations where they are facing discrimination. And but unfortunately, it's not in our professional military education curricula explicitly. And so that's perhaps an area of growth for us, as well as I think probably the other services as well. But I think, at least more from where I'm standing in this seat as the Dean of the Graduate School, that is one of the focus areas that I really want to make sure that we're constantly talking about, is this notion of diversity, equality, and inclusion in all of the curriculum that we provide through the various schools that we have. I think for now, that's where I would like to just stop and turn it over to Timi.
Thank you very much, Chaplain Lee. I'm going to share a screen here, and bear with me as we go through this together. Okay. All right. I'm going to play a short clip here. Let me know if you can hear it.
What experience did you have with, you felt like your race had a lot to do with how you were being treated or regarded by someone in charge of you?
A former basketball player here, they made him like cut all his hair off because I think the company officer said because his hair was so curly, it was unprofessional. Like, how can I come out of someone's mouth?
Yeah. It did.
Yeah, that literally came out of his mouth.
And I think that point really speaks to, there's a lot of midshipmen who are very good-hearted and don't find themselves often being guilty of these things and don't see them because they're not experiencing it through the lens of a minority, that when they hear these stories, like, they don't even believe that they happen. So like when you're sharing a case study and trying to talk about it, some midshipmen are just like, well, this isn't even realistic. Like, this would never happen. Yeah. When like the truth is this stuff does happen, like, often enough that we care to talk about it.
I wrote an essay. I wrote a pretty good essay in government. My professor told me, like, put me to the side, was like, this is a very good essay. Like who wrote it for you? You know, like, just kind of had a perspective on me. I was like, I can't use a thesaurus or something. You know what I'm saying? Like, how you going to just assume on me that I didn't write this?
Honestly, what broke my heart the most from these past couple of months, it has to be the retired captain. Like, how did you make it to a 06 position and you are willing to, I mean, I know he was on live by accident, but you're willing to talk this out loud. It's one thing if you think it. It is one thing if you think it, and that's still really bad. But to say it out loud is different. Like, you felt that you were angered by this Black female who was just sticking up for minorities or whatever the case may be. But it's sad because since I am a minority, I don't know who I'm interacting with. Like, I don't know their opinions on me. So it's kind of scary. As a Black female, I do hold a lot in. I don't feel like I can share my feelings because I don't want to, be labeled something else.
People, like, they think they know the gist of it, but they don't think about, like, the deeper, like, parts of it. And, like,
how far forward it travels.
Exactly.
My grandmother, on my mom's side, she was a sharecropper in Louisiana. So one of my early experiences with her was, you can't trust white people. I grew up, I went to like a Catholic school, so I was around a bunch of white people. So my mom would tell my grandma to stop. But she would be like, no, you can't trust white people. But that's her experience. She was a sharecropper.
All right. For me, being a first-generation college student is very strange. And me comparing myself to somebody whose great-grandfather graduated from Harvard, that's a large gap, right? Like, it's strange, though, when you have a conversation about, like, the city of Minneapolis. Like, there's a Kunta Kinte memorial statue outside that people don't even know is there.
Mhm.
And it's like one of those things is like, well, you don't know it's there because you're not taught it. Why aren't we learning these things? We learn everything else in that American history. Why aren't we learning African American history? Why aren't we talking about the traumas and things of that nature versus just trying to paint over it like with a white brush like it never happened?
Me and like 3 other like my close friends, we all picked the same ship. We just all happen to be black and former football players. We all picked the same ship in Norfolk. And after ship selection, I'm taking pictures. I'm on cloud 9. I know my future. This admiral comes up to me, and the reason why he comes up to me is because I believe we sat at the same table for the dinner for ship selection, and he asked me if we're all football players, and I said yes, sir. And then he says, "I'm gonna keep an eye out on your ship," like specifically just to me, which really didn't make a lot of sense to me because what could he is he for doing well? Like, is he assuming we're gonna wreck the ship? Like, what is he trying to hint at me and my close friends? And I can't really like put a lot subjectiveness on the situation because there were people who were lacrosse players on the same lacrosse team who picked the same ship. But I just know for that situation, it was very ironic how you came up to me. 4 black guys, we're all 6'2" and up, 240 and up, and then he's going to assume that we're going to do a terrible job. Mm-hmm. I just couldn't really wrap my head around that.
Mm-hmm. No congratulations.
No congratulations. First thing he said was he's going to keep an eye on my ship, and he's an admiral.
And so, yeah.
So good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining this webinar this afternoon. I am Timi, Lindsay, and I just want to talk about some different things that we just witnessed in the video. The question I said, do you hear what I heard? It's an 18-minute video, so if you can have time, go to the YouTube video. There's the link there. But did you hear the comments? As a Black female, I had to hold my feelings. I don't want to be labeled. A grandmother telling their grandson, don't trust white people because of her experiences. Race had an impact on how he was treated and regarded, but yet when they brought up these things, there are friends that they know, professors that they trust who don't believe what they're saying. Let's talk about the intersectionality, not only as a Black woman, but also as a first-generation college student, in the experiences that their others parents who've gone to college have had that were able to relay that to their child, whereas this person had no bearings from his family on what he should expect in higher learning. And there's a creation of doubt. When the comment was made to the young man, I'm going to keep my eye on you, because of his historic expressions by his grandmother, because of the experiences that he had growing up and at the Naval Academy, he felt in the negative. He did not take that as a positive comment at all. And he just saw the irony in it. So these undertones in the way that Black students felt at the Naval Academy was fear, lack of trust, and self-doubt. And these midshipmen, or they were actually newly commissioned officers, and this tape was done just after the George Floyd murder in 2020, were some things that we as future leaders, we as trainers have put into future leaders, and should they be going into the fleet feeling that way, into the field, leading others with this fear, lack of trust, and self-doubt. So it's a very heavy burden on those midshipmen, on those newly commissioned officers. It is a heavy burden on people of minoritized backgrounds to have to carry that and give them a sense of comfort. But let me tell you this, it is not just their responsibility. It's just not my responsibility to carry the burden of all Black people, of all women, of all persons with service-connected disabilities, since I'm a veteran now. It is not just our burden. This is everybody's burden and how we need to get through it together. So what should have been next in the conversation? If you could change the way you feel, or that those newly commissioned officers felt, what would you do? And now that we were here, what actions need to happen to unpack the systemic racism that exists in our society? And I'm going to talk about 4 E's at the end: education, empathy, engagement, and empowerment. Do you see what I see? I actually give a full facilitation brief on this graphic here. It is David Horsey is a contributor to the Los Angeles Times. He did this in 2014. But I felt as though that this graphic just shows so much. And it actually helps if you were to talk and people say, where is the history? How do you understand the road? How do you understand the obstacles that have fallen in people of color's way, specifically the Black or African-American community? You're Black and you go through this long, very dark shaded line, very curvy, of all types of obstacles that has existed since, for over 250 years for Blacks coming in through slavery. And we still have these things even up to today when we're talking about redlining or redistricting and things like that, to be able to have our voices heard at higher levels. We talk about the education systems. We talk about affirmative action just being overturned in at the Supreme Court level. Whereas if you have the white, it's a pretty straight, colorful road, and there have been benefits because of the things that have been endured by the Black community that the white community have come from. This is just understanding the road, how we need to understand how people who want to see and visualize the American game, there's a lack of understanding in what the historic aspects have played into the Black community. There were some comments earlier to say that we are a subsection of our American culture. And our experiences, our cultures, we as a military are representative of our American society. Therefore, people do grow up in our life experiences, where we lived, what type of education we had, how diverse our hometowns were, what type of churches were we groomed in, what type of education did we receive. All of these things actually help mold our social identities when we're at home. And then when we join the military, we then become a part of an organization. We're based on your duty station, the rank that you have, what type of duty status, what type of support network did you belong in, what type of house were you able to afford. All of these things all also help mold who you are. And these overall isms that you see on the outer ring, the set of beliefs that are considered authoritative over other beliefs, if there is a culture that promotes racism, that promotes sexism, that promotes homophobia, these things are actually openly talked about and not course corrected within an organization. So anything that you had received at home is only amplified by a culture in the military that could be benign to it, agnostic of it, and not willing to course correct. And this is where it can cause harm in our military. Going through we just see the racism, what the definition is. Racism can be systemic, it can be cultural, it can be interpersonal, it can be institutional, it can be all of these things. But what we have to understand is that these things, these isms, these systems have many aspects of harm in many different areas. I talked to you about redlining and redistricting. I talked to you about education, finance, and I'll talk about more, what type of grocery store you have. All of these things have impacts on you before you even hit the military. Sorry, my page is not sliding. Okay. And then we talk about the word racist. Oh my goodness, that couldn't be a worse, there could not be a worse derogatory word that can be put on a person because who believes that their race are better than others. And yes, the typical thing is white over Black, but let's be honest, let's change that rhetoric. If you're not Black, then you're okay, because usually the African Americans are at the bottom of the pile that is receiving the brunt of it. So why would somebody want to receive the brunt? By not being Black. So, but it is inherent piece that has come from history that says that one race is superlative to another. But people will say, but I'm not a racist. Because if they do imply that they are racist, it implies that they have a moral flaw. And no one wants to believe that they have a morality issue when it comes to being a human being or a leader in life. So I picked this picture. It is actually a Canadian metal rock group as moral flaw because nobody understands what that looks like. I didn't want to put a picture of a white person or a Black person, of a man or a woman. anybody up here because these activities in moral flaws come in actions. So the big acts, what people see are murder, theft, rape, lying, breaking promises. Those are like the cardinal ones. But there are other descriptors that are within our moral flaw that will be acts on what we are not supposed to do, even though we know what is right. And nobody wants to be conceived. And because that lies in under the other activities of murder and theft, therefore that shortcut memory we have, we must have a moral flaw. That's where people draw the line. And they'll tell you, oh, I'm not a racist. I know Black people. I've worked with Black people. I have a Black friend. That video that the young lady talked about, the captain who went on Facebook Live by accident was actually calling an admiral the N-word. And then he said, well, please help me. I've been kicked out of my country club, but I'm not a racist. I have Black friends. Well, you can appear to have Black friends on the outside, but is that friend the same as how you treat your other friends? Or is that just a person of symbolic, tokenism that I have this one Black friend? We talk about moral flaws. Be authentic in what you say and what you mean and how you define your relationship with people of different colors. So I want to talk about racial trauma. These are physical and psychological symptoms that actually are in people of color and when they've been exposed to stressful situations. If any of you remember the day after or after Memorial Day weekend of 2020, going into work the next day, how did your day start? Did you have your morning brief? It was a long weekend. How did everybody enjoy their cookouts? How did you go to any parades? Okay, here's the plan of the day. Did any of your organizations bring up the murder of George Floyd that happened the day before? I know mine didn't. We actually were ending a meeting and I said, and I was the only woman and the only Black in my senior leadership team. And I said, is anybody going to talk about what happened yesterday? And they all looked at me with blankness, as if they don't acknowledge it, then it must not have happened. I was livid because I wanted them to know that they had people who worked under them who were hurting. Well, why are they hurting, Timi? It didn't happen to them. Do they know George Floyd? Yes, those were the comments and questions that I got. No, it doesn't have to come from direct knowledge or direct action or direct receipt of this bad feeling. But this racial trauma exists, and it is a cumulative experience resulting in many chronic conditions which plague the Black community today. So they come from early socialization experiences, the grandparents and the parent stories. My mother and my father were not able to vote when they were of legal voting age. So they talk about that to me. They talk about, how they were talked in their face, like you N-words this and you N-words that. My mentor, a senior captain, said, Timi, I don't know if I can survive in your Navy because at least in my Navy, I knew who hated me. They were overt in calling me the N-word in the workplace. Whereas what you have, you don't see it. You don't see or know where it's coming. And then when you try to call it out, it's denied, and it's your word against theirs. So try to think of some issues of racial trauma and how it affects you as a person and in the community. Let's talk about some individualized ones. The COVID outbreak in the United States. There were nearly 1,500 reported incidents of anti-Asian racism in just 1 month. Do you know in the military, we cannot speak Spanish in the workplace or any other language in the workplace? Why is that? You can't speak it on the quarterdeck, on the watch deck, or anything. Not sure exactly why, but it sounds like the bottom line is the issue of trust. And then, of course, we see right now the anti-Semitism acts that continue with the issues and the war that's going on in Israel. There's systemic racism. The prison population. Blacks are only 13% of the US population, but they represent over 33% in jails right now. Racial displacement, exclusion, and segregation. I moved into this house 2 years ago, but not after I experienced where the seller of a previous house did not want to sell to me because I was Black, even though I offered the highest price, $20,000 over her asking price, and it was given to somebody who bought at cost, at the asking price. The erasure of Asian Pacific Islanders. They have been actually put together when we know that there are Eastern Asians, Southeast Asians, Pacific Islanders, the East Asians, and they all consider, there are many ethnic groups within each, but they're all put into one. Take another example of the Hispanic community, the many different ethnicities in the Latinx, communities that happen there. And when I would be on the admissions board and there was somebody said, how did this Hispanic person get a B in Spanish? And I was like, well, we get B's and C's in English. Why are you holding the same method to me? I don't get A's all the time in English. And then there's also, and what one culture identifies as one word in a Latin culture is not the same meaning in another culture. It is grouped together. And then the lack of cultural competency, just not understanding the backgrounds and the ethnicities and the experiences of these different cultures. There is a direct traumatic stressor that comes through when we have impacts of living in a society of structural system or being on the receiving ends of the individual racist attacks. That's what people assume, that racism is the only way that can be held. It has to be overt and it has to be direct. But as you can see in these 5 instances, there's so much more. There's vicarious traumatic stressors. I think the biggest thing is the brutal police killings, what we saw in George Floyd, the Selma incident, watching a Black man being arrested on the news. When you open the news, when you turn on the local news, what do they start off with? In the past, it used to be like the first 10 minutes. A Black man was charged today, or a Black woman was killed today. We're almost getting back to that now. And if you've seen the other news in the past where you ask a 3rd or 4th grader to look at a picture of people, and there's people of mostly white and one with maybe colored tan and then one person colored brown, they tell you who the bad person is. They point to the brown person. And then there's transmitted stressors. Those are the things that come from one generation to the next. And let's talk about that transgenerational trauma. For the white community, it is said that the transgenerational trauma lasts for 1 generation. For the Black community, however, it lasts 5 generations. 5 generations ago, my great-great-grandfather was released as a slave at age 8. So I am still experiencing those things that my great-great-grandfather James experienced through what he raised in his children, and so on and so on. Here's another one, historical or the transmitted stressors. At the top, there's a woman actually on a slave block. In the past, buyers used to come up, feel her breasts, feel her hips, to see if she can be childbearing. They pull her hair, they open her mouth, look at her teeth and things like that, and be sold for a mere, $50. And then come down to the bottom here in 2018, there's a wrestler here in South Jersey who was forced to cut his locks before he could wrestle because the referee found it uncomfortable. That referee was actually suspended for 2 years and had to go to some training to get himself together. But let's talk about the Crown Act, which was just passed 2 years ago. I'm sorry, I'm so out of time here. Nancy, what do you want me to do here? I can keep going or I can stop. Please let me know. But Black women are 1.5 times more likely to not want to go to work because of the stresses that they get, because they want them to straighten their hair. They want them to assimilate into what the workplace looks like. So,
Timi, I think, can you do this a little quickly and then we'll move?
Yep. So racial discrimination occurs in all types of trauma. And there is actually a post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a mental problem that exists in race-based trauma. But many scientists will tell you it's not a mental disorder, but it really is. We look at the survivors of sexual assault and look at their feelings that they have here on the left side. And then you look on the right side, the survivors of race-based trauma, and look at those. And you will see many of the same attributes are the same in both columns. And most importantly, each of them can develop into a post-traumatic stress disorder. So while the sexual trauma is a direct action in a case, the race-based trauma, I call it death by 1,000 cuts. So when a person comes to you and tells you that they're tired, it's probably because they have received the 1,000th incident of something that's there. So I talk about Amy Cooper, please look her up. I talk about Emmett Till. I talk about the moral courage, where President Truman actually passed his segregationist beliefs to actually integrate Blacks into the military 75 years ago this year. So when people say that I'm not a racist, I want you to look at the analogy of the old house. It looks a lot like the house that my great-great-grandfather James owned. But we've inherited this old house. Even though we didn't experience it, we may have taken over an old house and it has cracks and leaky roofs and things like that. And we also have to work from the foundation. That is the basis in which we all must work at, and being able to move up and have a stable foundation in a house in which to live in. And here's what's worked for me: educate, have empathy, engage, and empower, because it all starts with one. And I leave you with Mahatma Gandhi and talk about how your beliefs can ultimately lead to your destiny. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Timi. I want to, I appreciate what each of you shared, and I'm wondering if we could start with you interacting with each other and kinds of thoughts, questions, ideas that came to you that you might have for one another to share.
I liked how one of Timi's slides, and I appreciate both of you, from the perspective, that goes back to one of Timi's slides. So what do we do? How do we respond? What do we do next? And I think of it from a chaplain's perspective, and Colonel Lee and I have both been through CPE. Those who are on the webinar who've had clinical pastoral education, one of the things that it teaches you, especially when you get into the more advanced courses, I'm a slow learner. It took me 5 units of CPE to get it, is to get out of your own way. And I think what I've learned, both as a male, as a white male, as a chaplain, as a religious ministry professional, is 2 things. One is, don't just hear, but listen. And listening takes a skill set to just step back. Listen to what Captain Lindsay said about inheriting that old house and that foundation. And you can, I'm an old dog, and you can teach an old dog new tricks. I'm evidence of that. But also, so not only that, not only listening rather than hearing, but like I said before, getting out of your own way, setting aside your presuppositions. It's interesting in CP, one of the things we were really honed into, so we walk into a room, we assume a patient is going to want to hear prayer. And that patient may be so angry at God for getting cancer that the last thing they want to do is to pray. But that's our agenda. That's what we bring, and we need to rather pause and listen and hear what they bring and grow from them. So I deeply appreciate both of you from and really focusing on what she said, or what Captain Lindsay was saying, what do we do next? And I think listening and getting out of your own way are two of the great ways to manifest empathy. So thank you.
Thank you. Mark, are there things you'd want to add?
Yeah, I think I just want to emphasize or highlight, thank you for that, Timi, the notion of educating and really empathy, right? So education and empathy, like Dale just mentioned. And that's what we try to teach, of course, in CPE. And interestingly enough, the Army, the leadership manual that was published a few years ago, AR 6-22, talks all about empathy, the empathy of a leader, the emotional intelligence of leaders. And so that's really, I think, the more we educate, the more empathy we can exercise. And I like that last bit, to empower. And I think that is something that that I really want to see in our programs, not only empowering the people who are marginalized to find their voice, but to also empower the majority who have the voice and the power to speak up when they see and hear things that are not right. They know it, they feel it, and so all of that, I think, is an important part of what you've just discussed today.
Yeah, I just saw a comment over to the side of something that happened with a white man in a predominantly minority school, and he was traumatized. And I want you to acknowledge that trauma, and I want you to find your safe space. If this had to happen to somebody again, find your safe space to talk to somebody, have a friend or an ally, to talk about how it's impacting you. Because if that does not go, if that goes unnoticed and not checked, that will turn into resentment and a racial feeling against Blacks for the direct transgression that happened to you. And that often happens in minority, marginalized communities because they actually develop a hate because they see others doing well and that they're continuously being looked over. So there needs to be an engagement, there needs to be a discussion and understanding, and finding a safe place like a counselor or somebody or a chaplain or some type of community-based leader that can help facilitate that.
One of the things that I overheard from each of you, and certainly especially Mark and Timi from you, is the absence of clarity on the part of leadership and in training that racism will not be tolerated, and demonstrably showing that in their leadership. How do you account for that, and what needs to happen?
I'll go first. I think there is a lack of knowledge overall. So therefore, if you don't know, you therefore ignore it. So they don't know how to address it. There's not enough professionals who know how to teach it. And there is not enough intervention at the earlier stages of our leadership, of our military paths, to train it. And if we would just take the same training that we did for sexual harassment, sexual assault, for SIMEO, for LGBTQ, tail hook, what we had, and even the congressional hearings. Coast Guard is having their women's congressional hearing on Thursday. We haven't been brought to the Hill. We have DACOITS, Defense Advisory Commission on Women in the Service. We've tried the Military Leadership Diversity Consortium. We've tried the task force and all the other service things that we tried to put together, for somehow they never stick. In fact, with Task Force One Navy, I've seen more things come out of the other category that I led that were women's issues, to the point where there's now a women's policy branch back in the Navy. We didn't have that before, but that came from the actions of George Floyd. So who's benefiting? So sometimes it's important to keep the main thing, don't put so much on the plate. But, we need to be able to get at this early. And let me give you one more scenario. When they decided to have the extremism stand down, they put it on the diversity officers to actually put up the curriculum, make the curriculum. However, I was not qualified because I wasn't considered a skilled facilitator, and it had to go to the chaplains and the SEMIO officers to give the training. And then when they said that they didn't feel confident, they came back to me and said, will you please teach? That didn't go well. It did not go well in the training and the delivery. And I believe that the main reason why it did not go well is because we haven't been taught about racism in our ranks at the beginning. It was just forced on us and said, we are extremists. If we had understood that racism and what it does to a group, and then we have some extremist behaviors in there at the end, we would have better taken that in greater stride.
It's not what's the word? It's not subtle. And I'm also struck in the conversations that we had leading up to this webinar about the ways in which racism has consequences for reviews and promotion. So it's not like it's a matter of rougher for persons of color than not. It's a matter of real consequences in terms of rank and pay. Mark, you talked a little bit about, and helpfully, about the ways in which it affects. I don't know what the consequences might have been for a student where a supervisor was uninformed and unaware of his behavior, but I know that there are real consequences from the conversations I had in advance of this webinar, and I wonder if, and Dale, you also might want to weigh in on this. What can be done as I understand it, presently there is no required curriculum for persons who are officers to be informed about the facts and consequences of racism in the work that they do. Am I correct?
You're the one that's still on active duty, Mark, but as I look at the current policy, I don't see any implementing instructions into the training, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I'm pondering on that because I think, let me back up a little bit. I think in the military, at least in my experience, is that we like to cover it all up by saying we all bleed green in the Army, right? We are the big melting pot. And I bought into that melting pot idea, but now I kind of really despise that because we're not all the same. I think so. The premise that we are all one, and so let's forget about our differences in uniform. On one hand, it is good for esprit de corps to remember that we are all on the same team and we are all Americans. But on the other hand, what it does, it really diminishes the differences that are obvious and very visibly so. And I think that sort of then the tendency is keep it quiet, sweep it under the rug, don't talk about it overtly. And so a lot of the things that we experience is very covert, implicit, right? Because on the explicit policies and whatnot, the zero tolerance for discrimination of any sort. And yet we know that because of people's attitudes and the differences, it exists, right? So it's perhaps even better for us to just call it what it is, that we do have differences and we have differences of attitudes and prejudices and talk about that. I think, to your point, Timi, when George Floyd, that awful thing happened, one of the things that finally did happen, at least while I was in Germany, was to have that stand down and say, let's have some honest conversations. Let's have some honest conversations about our attitudes, about how we treat one another. And some of the very fruitful conversations came out of that, at least some of the sessions that I was involved with. And so, I think maybe we need to start talking about it and just really addressing it up front. in terms of promotions and pay, I have to say, the system that I have experienced, for me anyway, hasn't in any way felt discriminatory. But I also recognize that I am well educated, right? And I am seen as the model minority. I haven't made a lot of waves, right? I work hard. I've done what the Army has asked me to do and done it over and beyond. And so, what part of that was feeding into the institutional prejudices of what a good Asian person is supposed to be like in this society? I'm not sure.
Can I add on to that?
Yeah, Timi,
I'm going to
please
give
jump into that.
two different tracks. Imagine you sending one chaplain to an organization. This is part of your detailing process. So they're one of, they're supposed to be a special advisor to the command and doing this. Now imagine a Black person going to their command and they're being one of, or a female being one of. In their fit reps, the reporting senior thinks that they're doing well or writing well by them. But typically they're not going to rank them over their operations person or their executive assistant or any of those. And sometimes they fall out the bottom in a soft ranking. So when it comes up for promotion, they'll tell you at the board that they have a fair and open process that's there. But they need to understand that there's a systemic thing that happened way back at the beginning that doesn't give them the right words, the right soft rankings, the right endorsements for them to even be promoted to the next rank. That's why I was very happy that I was able to go to places like the National Naval Officers Association that had a detailer there. And we used to be required to bring our fit reps or our officer data cards and talk about how we course correct in the writing. And additionally, before I would submit any of my fit reps, I would go back to the communities that I wanted to excel in and get their input on my write-up before giving it to my reporting senior. So that I can say, this has been endorsed by my senior cyber warfare officer. So please look at it from this lens, because this is what's important to me for promotion. That's what the same thing needs to happen to you in your chaplaincy corps.
Right. I think, Timi, one of the things that we talked about earlier before the webinar was the ways in which, if knowing that both sexism and racism exist in the military and a promotional review comes up, it's hard to know the ways responses to either of those forms of difference intersect, amplify one or the other, and we know they're both present, shall we say, in the system. So I think that's a complication. Is that your impression as well?
It is definitely that, and I don't have the solution to get around that. I've hit my glass ceiling. When I was sent to the Naval Academy, I was being pulled out just before my look for major command. And I said, why are you doing this? And they said, well, the Navy needs you. Well, does the Navy acknowledge that I'm doing something that they're asking me to do? Yes. Well, then will I be still considered for flag? No. So they didn't say no. They said, I can't tell you that. So I hit my glass ceiling. And, it was almost a blessing that I hit my glass ceiling, because I knew I was retired. So my voice became a little bit more amplified. You have, again, in the chaplaincy corps or in at the lower ranks, you may have people who are weighing, is it more important for me to get promoted than it is for me to speak up for others? How can we make our descriptors, or what are they called for promotions, our precepts, stronger, that says that I'm a staunch advocate, regardless of race, color, creed, origin, in doing things that are not just aligned with what goes on in the organization. It's those soft skills that make the organization run.
Well, it strikes me that there are also some organizations in the military that, have embraced DEI education, and they embraced a form of it that doesn't acknowledge that racism is a form of difference, where there's a power difference. And so in other words, it's easy in a way to miss the mark while you're meaning to do well, and embrace an educational program that was created to be useful in in a corporate setting where they didn't want to irritate anybody, but wanted to check a box. Does that make sense? That can
It
happen. In
does.
other words,
It-
educating people.
Mhm. It does, but the irony is that most military like to compare themselves to Fortune 500 companies. So when we look at information technology, we look at the financial sector on the commercial
Yeah.
side. So how is that not? Why wouldn't we not look at best practices that are shared elsewhere?
Well, I guess what I was getting at is that it takes skills to identify a program that is in fact deeply informed, that defines racism as a system of advantage based on race.
Yes, and that takes learning, and it takes
Mhm.
time. And if you're looking at
Mhm.
references that were developed in 2010, you're antiquated. It is a human factor. So if you're not looking at anything, I'd say if you're looking at things before 2018, you can look at the history of it, but you need to see that it's evolved. So acknowledge that the history exists. So, bring back those banned books and look at the history, but also be open, empathetic, be educating, and engage with others so you can get their understanding and their interpretation of the readings or the theories, critical race theory, on how this worked.
Mhm.
So it takes time, and it evolves.
Yes, and it takes intentionality,
Yes.
I think, is part of what each of you is
Intention
saying.
and consistency. So
Yes.
like depending on who's ever in the top office will determine how much this is stressed. But in 2025, this could all go away again, just like we were told to not talk or educate in 2020 by executive order. Thankfully, in 2021 was all brought back.
I know, Mark, since Timi is not in chaplaincy and you are, as I've had conversations with training programs, one of the things I'm aware of in chaplaincy is that it can be several years before an incoming chaplain has a course that addresses racism and the ways in which it could affect those for whom they care. What would need to happen for racism to be one of the forms of difference treated oppressively that comes up early in terms of the ways in which, as you and Timi have described, it's present from the time when a person enters the military or enters the chaplaincy.
Yeah, I think, well, if you're talking about racist attitudes and all of the prejudice that each of us come in with, that's pre-existing, right? Early in
Sure,
life.
it is.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. And so I think when it comes to education, though, I mean, part of it, it needs to be part of the basic officer course that we have
Mhm.
for chaplains at every
Right.
one of the branches. At least in the Army, it needs to be a planned process because training and doctrine command, under which we all fall, the PME side as well as the graduate school, um, it is a process in which to get the program of instruction corrected, built, and put in place. But I think it could be part of when we talk about working with pluralistic environments, right? We often focus, at least in the chaplaincy, we talk about working with different faith groups. But in it, we need to also talk about different cultures and the inherent biases and prejudices with which each of us come into this chaplaincy and the military. So I think that would be a good place for us to look at doing and including into the curriculum.
Mhm. The other thing that you mentioned that that some folks on the webinar are not in chaplaincy, and you talked about the importance of advising command. And so I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit and make it particular in relation to advising command regarding the urgency, the priority, if you will, for curricula, for training that would address what is as depleting as racism is in the readiness for military and for the chaplaincy. How would you advise, Mark?
I think I would go back to educating really and talk about what it is. I mean, the reality of the
Mhm.
differences among the people within our ranks, right? Within the military, each month we have some diverse group celebration, right? And that's highlighted, and we talk about it, and speeches are given. But are we really talking about how those different groups within our ranks contribute positively? And then how our negative attitudes, our biases and prejudices could contribute negatively if we're not educated properly. And I think that's part of the perhaps I really am reticent to talk about training as if it's yet another brief by PowerPoint, or death by
Oh,
PowerPoint,
sure.
as we say in the
Yeah.
Army, but really have some frank conversations. And I think that would be the best place for us to talk about the conversations of the differences. I remember when I was in seminary, it's the racial issue was always black and white, and I said, well, "What about the Asian? When can I be part of this conversation?" They looked at me and just moved right along. But I think that's the opportunity we have in the military, is that we can talk to advise our commanders and say, we've got all kinds of diversity. Why don't we talk about the differences within our ranks and what brings us together, what unifies us, and highlight all of those things? And I think that would be the advice that I would give to the commanders.
Wouldn't you agree, Mark, that and I've been involved in the curriculum process, and the curriculum process is like the Palm process. It is, you're looking years and years out. It's as slow as molasses. But if there's an incident, and the chief of staff of the Army or the CNO says, we're going to have a stand down tomorrow on this topic, and my team is going to work overnight to provide you the talking points, it gets done. And from our chaplaincy lane, I think we have a great opportunity to advise our commanders and to say, hey, before this, hits you in the back of the head and finishes your career, that always wakens them up. You might want to address this topic. Well, then we also have to be prepared to have a solution. You can never make a suggestion without a solution, and to be ready to meet with the command master chief, to meet with the command sergeant major, and have a plan ready in hand to say, we've got a stand down or a curriculum ready to go that we think will be useful to the command and maybe to the TICOM and to other commands. We within chaplaincy and advisement have more access to the COs than I think we take.
Right.
For me, I agree, but there has to be a willingness to put it into more policy.
Sure.
And in instruction to hold them accountable. And I would do it as a developing piece in a military person's career. And I would call it cultural intelligence. So Chaplain Lee spoke about emotional intelligence, but there's three core ones: emotional, cultural, and inclusive intelligence. And I would start off with the emotional, understanding themselves and how they fit in. Culture, understanding the drive and understanding the different cultures that you work with. And as you become a leader, how do you become an inclusive leader? And those things need to build. So it's not going to be a GMT where you have the same training over and over, but it needs to be, as you go to the non-commissioned officers course, you get this level. As you go to basic, you get this level, and it goes on to help you and go in this, so that if we are to have a stand down over a specific incident, then we would be able to break out and talk about what this means at their respective levels. There was a midshipman who said that Breonna Taylor got her justice the day that she was shot, and he was kicked out, and he fought legally, and we all said that he should not be a military officer because he will not get the trust and be able to work with other people based off of his biases and his racist beliefs. He had an effective enough lawyer to be able to come back in and be commissioned. But one of the things that he said was that he did not receive proper training. Everybody always goes back there saying, I wasn't trained properly as their scapegoat for this. Until we have accountable measures in the area of racism, we're not going to get anywhere. So it starts at the top with policy.
I agree with you about that. And, I'm struck by, it's not just not knowing. When you look at, Dale, you began by, in your beginning, you included the fact that one of the branches, or the Coast Guard, had withheld information that was incriminating regarding clear evidence of racism. And we know that it happens also on the academy's campuses. So it's not just education. There has to be a demonstration of leadership that this matters. One of the things that has really made an impact on me preparing for this webinar was opportunities to talk with some persons of color in the military who couldn't even talk. We had conversations about other issues that we were going to do a webinar on, but in this case, they were mute. The pain was that deep. And others that said, I couldn't manage to be on that webinar. So I think that there's an unacknowledged for many, at least many who have skin that looks like mine, for how substantial the harm is. Even if a person is able to do their work, the consequences for them, the toll on them, I think is out of the consciousness of persons who are racially privileged in the military. This is a concern that I have, and I'm grateful that Mark and Dale, for example, you were talking about there are ways to move ahead with naming this earlier, for demonstrating that that the leadership insists on this, and that would itself be a substantial advance for folks that may think of military moral injury in too few a categories for the fact and the longevity of racism as morally injurious in the military as it is in our country. I want to give each of you a closing comment, a chance to make a closing comment if you wish. We've come to the end of our time.
Do we want to go in the same order?
Sure, that'd be fine.
Sure. As a white male, I've had to step aside and see life through my son's eyes. He's Black and Asian. And I've watched him get promoted when I've shown up at his job, only for his boss to discover, oh, this is your dad. Watched him, I know it's outside of the military, but watched him as a strong Christian young man endure comments that just send shivers down my spine. And it has made me realize to step aside from my own biases and see the world for what it is, and to be empathetic and to grow.
Mark or Timi?
One of the things I think for me over the years, like I said, is to recognize how I have been complicit in participating, or even because of just ignoring and allowing the attitudes and prejudices and racist comments slide by. And so the thing that I want to really do now in this stage of my career, and hopefully set the stage for the next generation of Asian American chaplains that are in the Army, or just in the Army in general, is to say that we need to empower ourselves, and we need to speak up. We need to not take on the mantle of the invisible, quiet minority and just sort of be subsumed by the majority culture just because we're lighter in skin color. So that is one thing that I want to continue to advocate for and to educate the next generation, both majority culture as well as those who are minority, to speak up for ourselves and to be the advocates for those who have not the power nor the voice.
For me, I would encourage everyone to come from a place of cultural curiosity. Everyone's willing to have a conversation. So instead of coming to somebody and say, "Why would you say that?" you can say, "I'm curious. Help me understand, what the meaning is behind what you say." Having some good communications rather than more accusatory or accusatory remarks with "why would you say that?" As a facilitator, you just say, "Help me to better understand your frame, your frame of mind or your statement, because I want to know, I want to help." And having that helps trust, it helps understanding, it helps all of those different things. I'm still trying to understand the meaning of retirement. I don't know what that means. So that's why I took it as my calling to continue my advocacy in bias literacy and being able to understand, have more respectful dialogue to help our organization and our community and our country become better. So I started my business. Nancy has my contact information. You can reach out to me, but I would be happy to facilitate conversations in your spaces as well.
I want to thank you all for your willingness to prepare for and to engage in this conversation. It's a very important beginning, and I hope the Soul Repair Center will be able to return to it. I also appreciate the engagement of the folks who were observing and participating by engaging your ideas in the chat. I appreciate this, and I'm hopeful that the center will return to this conversation, and I'm hopeful that what you've shared will bear fruit. Thank you very much.